So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to this STARS webinar session. I'm Tony Schönenberger. I'm the Executive Chairman of STARS. STARS is a global forum for dialogue to discuss developments and trends which will impact the society as a whole, but particularly also our businesses in the next couple of years. Today, we are continuing the webinar series on sustainability, particularly also on the circular economy. I think it's a must for everybody, for any leader, to better understand how little our economic system is circulating. So we have the great privilege to talk to Martijn LOPES CARDOZO today. He's a real expert, particularly on this very subject. Gordana is introducing Martijn in a minute. Martijn, again, thank you very much for joining us. We are very much looking forward to your insights. I want to introduce you now to our moderator, Gordana Kirans. Gordana is a former professor for international business. She's now managing partner of her consultancy in Croatia. One focus of her work is circular economy. President of the STARS Southeast Europe alumni chapter, she's also in addition to this. Gordana designed this important series of 6 webinars on sustainability and circular economy. And she's also moderating these webinars. Gordana, again, thank you very much for your support, and the floor is yours.
Thank you, Tony, for your introduction, and good morning from me. Welcome. Good afternoon, good evening as well. As I can see from the attendance list, as we are all around the world again, spread across all continents. Welcome to this very important session with another extraordinary guest. Before I introduce our extraordinary guest, Martijn, welcome first.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Before I introduce our another extraordinary guest, I have an offer for you, or invitation rather. Those of you who attended before, you are very welcome to ask your questions in the Q&A session. We have only 30 minutes, which is very short when we talk with extraordinary people. There are so many things to discuss. So start thinking about your questions now. Martijn, it's a true pleasure. I have been following your work for a very long time. I know that you are a serial entrepreneur, that you started companies in the area of circular economy before, but the most crucial role that I remember about you is the role of the CEO, or now former CEO of the circular economy from Amsterdam. Because you have been publishing the Circularity Gap Report. In the past years, we might have gotten the impression that we are on the path to a circular future. There are numerous press releases, commitments from policymakers, companies, and so on and so on. And we thought, oh, the world is on the right path, everything is going all in the right way. And then the Circularity Gap Report gets published and we are back in reality. We are how little circular. Next one is due in 24 January. So do you mind sharing with us the news, how little we are doing at the moment?
Well, I'm going to tease you a little bit on the news, but what you're telling exactly right, Gordana. And I would argue, indeed, especially in Europe with the European Green Deal and the Circular Economy Action Plan, that circular economy has become more mainstream and has been talked about quite a bit. But indeed, if you look at a bit more of the macro picture, and for those who are not aware, Circularity Gap Report tries to look at how circular is the whole world. And the reason we did that about 6 years ago is exactly what you mentioned, Gordana. There was a lot of hand-waving and circularity and also very different ways people approached circularity. So you had the people who were just sort of focused on hardcore, materials and recycling, and other people viewed it almost like a new world religion and anything in between. So what we try to do is basically try to put our arms around, what are we really talking about here? And given the fact that, except for a little bit of helium, all materials actually stay on the Earth, you can actually look at, how much materials are we digging up each year? What happens with them? How much is again used again in a logical way? And if you then look at what's been happening, is that the use of virgin materials has really exploded since the Industrial Revolution. We're now using more than 100 billion tons of materials each year. And if you look in the last 10 years, we've used more materials than in the whole previous century combined. So think about that, 10 years, 100 years. And that number is again expected to double within the next 20 years. So if you then look at what's been sort of reused, and that's sort of the circularity metric, you basically look how much new materials enter into the world, and what is the amount that is sort of cycled in a useful way. It's, by the way, one of the metrics you can use. There's a lot of different circularity metrics. And what you there see is that although there's quite some effort in trying to do that, the amount of virgin materials grows at a higher rate than what's happening on the other side. So you could say that the linear machine is basically still outpacing us. And as a result, the amount of circularity is actually dropping.
Yeah, this was the surprising effect. The first, when you published the first circularity gap report back in 2018, I remember seeing the number 9.1%, I believe, irrecircular. Yeah. And then it gradually went down every year instead of going up, despite all the commitments and regulatory frameworks and so on and so on. So how can we turn this trend around?
Yeah, well, so there's sort of four big levers you can pull in this process. And the first one, is you have to slow down the metabolism of the Earth. So you have to basically use materials much longer, right? So if you think about digging up something from the Earth, turning it into single-use plastics, and then throw it away, you basically go from virgin to waste extremely quickly. So slow down, use things longer. The other one is using less. And there's, of course, a whole bunch of strategies that underlie that, from, using materials smarter, lightweighting, and things like that. But, granted, there's also a big level of overconsumption. Look at the fashion industry with the fast fashion, and, that only 20% of people's typical wardrobe is used. A lot of clothes are actually produced and not used at all, or not sold at all. So there's also a lot of waste in the system. Look at food waste, right? So for the whole production chain, there's a massive amount of food that's lost. So just also reducing the inputs and going down from that 100 billion tons to a smaller amount. The first strategy you can apply, for lever you can apply, is basically use regenerative materials, or make clean, as we call it. And in that case, of course, if you use biomaterials, they can be either composite or cycled completely. So you don't really have the waste issue at all. So that really helps. And then finally, of course, have the strategy where you're trying to, cycle, which I would not define just as recycling the materials, but also refurbishing, try to really get it at a high quality level. So, use less, use longer, make clean, and cycle are the four things. And then there's, and we can go into that a bit later. If you then look at what are the basic human needs, there are sort of four big systems that address like 80 or 90% of the whole world, which is in, providing shelter for people, mobility, food, and of course all the other consumables.
Yeah, now you're addressing some really important topics. An invitation for our audience to look at some of the first webinars we did in this series. The first one about systems thinking with Dr. Anne Birney, School of System Change, where she talks about reframing some of the questions. Like, for example, you talked about plastics, and her approach was to reframe. What do we need bottles for? We need people to hydrate. So if our goal is hydrating, how can we accomplish that goal without using plastic? And the other webinar that was also very fascinating was with Dr. Janez Potočnik, the former EU commissioner. He talks to you, he's a familiar figure, of course, to you. He talks about material flows extensively. That's the only one that goes 1 hour, and he shows a lot of statistics in this area. It's truly eye-opening. So I invite you to look at those as additionally. Yes, you are addressing different systems. You also addressed at the beginning that you are looking at circularity worldwide. So what you do circularity, overall circularity with the circularity gap report for the whole world. Then you have circularity gap reports for countries, cities, and even industries. So how do you find a common ground in this? How do you measure circularity in areas that might appear like comparing apples to pears?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. So we actually started off at the global level where we launched it around Davos, World Economic Forum, to really sort of put it on the map and also create a bit of reality check and not that we're not against all these very good initiatives, but also really have a big steer or on the highest level, are we actually accomplishing our goals or not, and putting some real science behind it. If you take the Circularity Gap Report, and it translates actually really well to countries, because of course the world is made up of countries, and what happened is after we started launching it, there was actually countries saying, hey, if the world is 8.6 or 9.1 or 7.2% circular, how are we doing as a nation, and what are the big things we should be doing given our economy and our geopolitical location in the world? So we have done now over 15 countries in the world, starting actually with Austria, and we did the Netherlands, Sweden, Poland, Switzerland, Ireland. We did one for the continent of Latin America. So we're also starting to venture out of Europe. And there you actually can come up with a similar metric. And of course, I always want to reiterate, this is sort of the highest level metric, right? And then you have to go into more detailed metrics to really make it actionable and look at which sort of levers you can pull. And then from nations, it makes a lot of sense to go to cities because, of course, there, if you look at the carbon footprint and where people live and where people consume, they're the hotspots of where that's happening. And if you want to influence behavior, that's a really good place to start. Also, because cities have quite a bit of autonomy to, they're a bit less dependent on, EU policy or national policy, can move faster. And also there's a very clear incentive for them, given the fact that, if you do circular economy, it can be something that's really inspiring for the citizens of the city. It has also to do with greening the city, taking cars out of the city. So formulating that as a circular economy initiative, which also creates meaningful green jobs, is also something that's very attractive for the city and for the mayor to get reelected. So there we have seen a lot of traction, and we've worked with over 50 cities around the world. We also build a whole set of digital tools that we're working with city networks like eClay to roll that out globally. If you go to the company level, it actually gets a bit more complicated because there you're really into an industry, right? So if you're producing steel, you have very different metrics and very different things you have to look at than if you are in a services or in a tech company. And for the people who are really interested, and I think we can easily spend another half hour and whole seminar specifically on this, we actually published quite recently a circular indicator library, and it basically gives you an overview of, depending on which industry you are or which sector you are, what are the good indicators to follow. And actually, there's a lot of work going on right now in trying to standardize that and bring that into the accounting standards. Particularly so because depending on how you view it, a large portion of the carbon footprint of companies is in the scope 3 emissions. So that's basically, outside of the walls of the building, in the supply chain, how the product is used and how the product is produced outside of the realm of the company. And if you really want to influence those scope 3 emissions, you really have to look at circular economy strategies. They basically are most relevant for accomplishing their scope 3 emissions. So I think that interplay is going to be really interesting as companies move into science-based scope 3 targets.
Interesting. Let's stay with industry for a little longer. When we look at these different industries, there are, let's call it low-hanging fruit, the closest. Which industry has the biggest potential to shift to circularity, or at least more than it's in now? And where are the biggest challenges? Which industry is facing?
Yeah, well, I think in principle, industries can apply those sort of 4 things that I mentioned, right? And in some cases, it's a bit more on perhaps the use less, and the other ones it's much more using longer, and the other one is more like regenerative, and then there's sort of the cycling industry. So different strategies apply to different industries. So we sort of see 3 big drivers of what's happening. So I already mentioned, the carbon and especially the scope 3 emissions. And what has been happening with the scope 3 emissions is that it's actually becoming mandatory to start reporting on that, not only in the Netherlands, but also starting in 2026 in the US if you're more than $1 billion of revenue. And if you take those 2 economies, you pretty much have to do that for your whole company if you're a certain size. So I think that's an area where people really would start focusing on circularity just to hit their targets. The second one, I think, is regulatory. And there, what's happening, especially in Europe, it took a bit of time, but especially in the last couple of years, pretty much every half year there has been a new regulatory package. Right to repair, anti-greenwashing rules, single-use plastics, and I would expect that to continue. And what you're seeing there is that quite a bit of the regulatory frameworks that have been developed starts to be adopted in other places in the world. We've seen that mostly California, but also New York in the US. We've seen strong interest from China. So that will influence companies quite a bit. And the last one is actually, I think, consumer. So I think I mentioned things like, fashion and fast fashion, or single-use plastics. Those things are starting to become unacceptable. And I think you're seeing the same with flying, that people say, well, if we want to do that, we want to do that in a sustainable way. And if you're a product company, like plastics or fashion, you really have to think about, new business models or repair models, or at the minimum, making sure your product lasts, right? And it's not like after you wash it once or twice, you have to throw it away. So So there we see a lot of interest from companies just because they know that if they don't adopt their model, they will lose the confidence from the consumers.
Yes, exactly. There also in Germany, the due diligence model for framework for the whole supply chain also put a pressure on the scope 3 for those companies. That thousands of companies are affected by that. So of course you mentioned the European Green Deal. The European Union is reacting very much to these regulatory issues. United States has it within the Inflation Reduction Act. What are other reactions from policymakers? What else are you observing around there?
Well, one of the find really interesting is the intersection of circularity in the global south, and especially around financing that. So we've been working with the World Bank and a lot of the multilateral development banks, so African Development Bank, Asian Development Bank, and others, European Investment Bank. And of course, if you look at the world, we're in different places. So in the Circularity Gap report, I think 2 years ago, we described that as, you have countries that are in build mode. So they really are building up their infrastructure. They're investing a lot in building up their stock, infrastructure, built environment, mobility, et cetera, et cetera. And on the other hand of the spectrum, you have the shift countries who have built out or infrastructure, but really have to shift and reusing that asset in a clever way. So, if you look at built environment, you're really thinking in Europe much more about refurbishing and, reusing that existing stock as opposed to demolishing it and throwing all the resources away. Whereas in the global south, where there's a massive build-up, you can really think about designing for circularity and applying those principles. So, building homes that can be disassembled with product passports, et cetera, et cetera. And what's been key in the work with the World Bank and the multilateral development banks is how can we actually bring the necessary financing in place so those nations can actually apply circularity principles from the get-go and not make the same mistakes that we did here in building out that infrastructure, which is quite hard if you have to revamp that at a later stage. So I think you see a lot of efforts in that, and often it's a bit with solar, right? So if you would be especially in the global south, it's more attractive now to build out solar than to build out new coal plants. And I think the same will apply for a lot of the circularity. If you look at it over the complete life cycle, it's actually a superior business model, especially if you take all the externalities into consideration and reduce waste in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you mentioned in an important topic, of course, the aviation. India just, its number, I don't know. India is investing hugely into the infrastructure, just like China did years back. And I think they're planning something like 70 new airports or something like that, something really, huge number. So we, of course, can imagine how many passengers will use this and travel, which is fine. I mean, families would like to be together in a big country like that, but we know the downside of that. So we do have to accelerate the sustainable aviation area. There is a lot happening in that area too. There is a connection with the Paris Agreement and staying on track to, we're still hoping 1.5 degrees, but let's see. So what is the connection? How can circularity support the goals of the Paris Agreement?
Yeah, that's a great question, Gordana. And indeed, I think the last number I heard is that we're now at 1.45 degrees. So I think also there reality starts to sink in. That being said, I think somebody put it quite eloquently. 1.6 is better than 1.7, and 1.7 is better than 1.8. So we should still aim to keep the world as cool as possible. So what we did is 2 years ago, we actually, and we try to do that every year, we link the Circularity Gap Report to a specific theme. So the one that's launching next week, I, by the way, invite everybody to attend. Feel free to, if you go to the LinkedIn of Circle Economy Foundation, you can find the sign up there. And this year it's really tied to all the social elements. So, what does it mean for people? What does it mean for work, etc. And 2 years ago, we basically linked it to climate. And if you do the deep dive there, you will find that the strategies that I just outlined have the potential to save 50 to 60% of global greenhouse gas emissions. So, of course, fossil fuels is the low-hanging fruit, and we should very quickly decarbonize from that. But a lot of those emissions are also tied to how we, build buildings, right? How do we use materials? And, if you apply those 4 strategies across those 4 big systems, you can you can double circularity. And we did some back of the math envelopes in terms of what types of interventions that would require. And these are all based on technology that are here now. And I think that's also interesting from a circular, you also touch on a lot of behavioral things. And, some of the things that we are now, we're just sort of used to, especially in the US, live in big houses, drive in big cars, eat and throw away a lot of food and things like that. And I think also and I'm not trying to put it on the individual, but like if we would adopt and develop a different standard there would be massive materials and as a result of that, massive CO2 savings.
Yeah, we just have to scale down a little bit our egos sometimes showing off, which was good for the economy in the past, but now is
well, ultimately, Gordon, I also think it's not good for people, right? So, I think if you look at happiness indexes and things like that, it doesn't really correlate that strongly with material wealth in a sense of bigger cars and bigger homes and things like that.
Yeah. We talked about regulatory frameworks, and these, of course, tightening and forcing companies to change, to shift. But we are also seeing an increased number of what we call circular washing in reference to the previous greenwashing, despite regulatory pressure to actually eliminate that. But we still see it. I mean, I see it among big companies, entrepreneurs, and so on. I work a lot also with entrepreneurs. So how do you recognize, what are some of the indicators for you that we are talking about circular washing?
Well, maybe let me take a bit of a controversial perspective here. I actually don't mind if people do circular washing, especially not initially, because it's often the start of a journey, right? So it often starts with the CEO standing up and saying, throwing some target out, we want to be 50% circular by this date, not even knowing what it takes in order to get there. And then typically what happens next is, the marketing department and other people then try to find ways or come up with very cute examples or product demos to sort of showcase they're on their way. And sort of at least lends some credibility to the bold statement the CEO made. The reason I'm not that concerned about it is because I think ultimately it will catch up with people. And I think you've seen that now also in the science-based target setting. People throw out numbers, they don't know how to get there. But then those numbers become commitments, and those commitments start to get measured, and then the reality sink in. So to some extent, actually, it is a way for people to get started on it. And I don't think it's always malicious. It's also often done with good intentions, and nobody is against it. But then, and I think that's where your question comes in, we need to have, validate those things. And that's why we're, one of the reasons we publish a circularity gap report, to do that on a global scale. We're also leading the measurement efforts in the platform for accelerating the circular economy, together with Accenture and World Resource Institute. And ideally, we want to, we're not there yet, but get into, a typical, science-based type target measurement framework, so it can become part of the ESG and financial reporting. So yeah, for sure. But for now, let people come up with bold statements. The more, the merrier. And then, go into that funnel. And then I think reality will sink in.
Yeah, then the pressure. And I believe we also need more honesty, accept that this won't happen overnight. Change takes time. I mean, we know from companies that accomplished great circularity results, it took time to get there.
Yeah,
we are actually over time. But if you, Martijn, if you don't mind, just one last question, specifically for STARS network, which is for leaders of the next generation, decision makers who face these difficult decisions and these difficult goals that they have to set up for investors and other stakeholders. So which steps should they take, in your opinion, Martijn, to reach more circularity within their companies?
Yeah. Well, maybe my big advice will is I think even more so than with decarbonization, circular economy is at the heart of how your company operates, right? So you're really looking into the supply chain, how your product is used, et cetera, et cetera. So if you think about sort of, how to start with circularity, I would really argue, don't make it sort of a separate standalone activity that tries to influence the core business, but in your next strategy cycle, really sort of put it at the heart of how you want to operate as an organization. And then you can also find the co-benefits in terms of, better branding, lower costs, smarter material use, superior products, superior delivery models. And not only use it for a sustainability goal, but also for a real competitive advantage.
Awesome. I mean, I could go on and on, but we have a limited time frame. So thank you, Martijn, so much for your insights today. Thank you for joining us and for sharing your experience in this area. It's very, very valuable.
It was a real pleasure. Thank you so much.
Our audience, thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed this webinar. You will find the recording on YouTube a few days from now if you want to look up at some of the numbers and topics that Martijn mentioned. Next two webinars will be in the afternoon, because our next two speakers are from the United States. And you might be now wondering, something doesn't add up here. We talked about 6, and now you are saying we have 2 more. You are correct. We will have overall together 7 webinars, because we got another extraordinary speaker, and we decided to go with a bonus webinar at the end of February. So next one, 9 February, the very last one, the bonus webinar on 29 February, both of them in the afternoon. I look forward to meeting you there. Thank you and goodbye.